To all those of you who are mothers out there, we appreciate you very much and so glad to see you. I was sitting there remembering when we lived in Southern California, Mother's Day was a huge day. You look around, everybody had corsages on. It's just the way the culture that was there. Every mom was given flowers, except Robin, because I never remembered to do that. So. Please open your New Testaments to Mark chapter 15. Let's see, I've got this on. Pushing the right button. Want to forward me there, Kevin? Mark 15. Again, we're really delighted to see all of you. We do have some visitors with us. We're thankful for all the people that are joining us on Zoom or even watching on YouTube later. We're grateful for your making that effort. We are continuing our study of the life of Jesus as it's recorded for us in the Gospel of Mark. We finally made it to chapter 15. And it's a scene that we are very familiar with, and that's of Jesus being brought by the Jews before Pilate. The entire text this morning is verses 1 through 15. We are not going to read that now ahead of time. We're going to be going through that fairly verse by verse as we go there. We've already met a number of players in this drama of bringing Jesus to the end of his life, and now we're going to add a new name to the rogues gallery that we've already seen, and of course that's going to be Pilate. Also, we've seen God's hand involved in all of this. Jesus, by his words, by his actions, even what we're going to see today, is determining the outcome, which is the fact that he is going to be crucified. We had a whole lesson earlier on the trials of Jesus, the Jewish trials of Jesus. And that's where we're actually coming to this morning, is right following that. And I'd like you to keep your Bibles open to Mark 15 this morning, because I'm not going to have, except I think for the first verse, they will not be on the screen. You'll need to follow along, if you will, in your Bibles. I do want to do what I normally do, which is kind of give you the setting, what's going on here, and then we'll just go through it verse by verse and explain what's going on. So let's begin with the setting. It's still not operating correctly. Is it going? Nothing's happening. There we go. So we've already talked about the Jewish trials. They have been completed. At least two of them have been completed originally. Those trials, those first two with Annas and Caiaphas, took place between about 1 in the morning and 3 in the morning. When those trials ended, also Peter's denials ended. Jesus is going to be held from about 3 in the morning till 5 in the morning. I think I showed you the room in the bottom of the house of Caiaphas and Annas where he was probably held. During that time that the Jews are taking out their frustrations on him, he is mocked, he is spat upon and slapped and hit with a fist, blasphemed, just everything is going on. At 5 in the morning, the Sanhedrin, wanting to maintain a veneer of legality, because trials were to be conducted in daylight at the very early morning, they hold their last and final mock trial. That's recorded for us in Luke chapter 22. And this is the third and final phase of the Jewish trials. And they are now going to be forced, too far, to bring Jesus to Pilate. Verse 1 in our text says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So they've reached their decision. He's worthy of death, and they're going to hand him over. Now, the statement in the Gospel of John kind of gives us a little bit more insight into the leadership's heart. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. I tell you, that's a picture of the worst hypocrisy ever. Would you be clean to observe the Passover if you've got murder on your hands? If you're involved in killing the Son of God? And obviously they did not see this. So the reason that they're having to take him to Pilate is because the Jews did not have the right of execution. The Latin term jus gladii means the right of the sword. And the Romans had maintained or retained that right by their law, that only they could put people to death legally. And so you're thinking, well, what about Stephen? And what about the time Paul was stoned? Those are all mob actions. There's not even a sense of legality about those. But doing that to Jesus and taking him out and stoning him would not be advantageous to the Jewish leadership's agenda. They want to have a veneer of legality. They want the impression that everything that was done on the up and up. And like the Jewish trials, there's going to be 3 civil trials, 3 trials before Gentile courts. This is the first one that we have here in Mark 15. The second one will take place before King Herod. That's not covered by Mark, and consequently not covered by us today, but it is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, verses 6 through 12 in chapter 23. And then the third trial before Pilate is going to take place, and it's also in Mark. So if you want to take the trial of Herod and put it into Mark, if you look real carefully between verse 5 and 6, that's where it is. In that particular spot is where that trial took place. I want you to also realize that Pilate knows exactly what's going on here. What Jesus has been doing for the last 2 or 3 years was not done in a corner, wasn't done covertly at all. Especially just a week ago, you had the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And Pilate's normally here. He would be up in Caesarea, which is where the governor's palace was. But he's down here because this is where there's crowds, and there's a need to keep the peace. And when Jesus came into Jerusalem, there's these multitudes saying, here's the Messiah, he's the new leader, he's the coming king. Their actions were quite public. And of course, it's Pilate's job to keep the peace, to make sure there's no uprisings or rebellions. He's probably been aware of Jesus for months, if not years. Pilate would have already had to have authorized the guard, the contingent of soldiers, to go and arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. So he knows what's going on, but he's also painfully aware of the Jews and their character. So as we come to this, the Jews, you need to understand, are not bringing Jesus before Pilate to try him. They're not bringing Jesus to Pilate for Pilate to try him. In John's gospel, or the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 29, so Pilate came out to them, because they can't go inside because they don't want to be unclean, and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? He wants to know what the charges are. They say in verse 30, if he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Now, again, they're wanting Pilate to give them a rubber stamp. They perhaps assumed that Pilate would do that since he provided the soldiers to go and arrest Jesus. But listen, arresting somebody and putting them to death is completely different. And Pilate, at this point, will hold the right of execution in check and in his hand. Basically, what the Jews are saying here is you don't have to worry about what's going on with Jesus. We would not have brought him to you if he were not guilty. We're trying to save you some time. So in John chapter 18 and verse 31, Jesus said, I'm still stuck here, Pilate said, then take him yourself and judge him by your own law. They replied, "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. So basically Pilate saying, no charges, nothing's going to happen. Otherwise you just take him and do with him what you want. Now, as I'm looking at this, there seems to be two reasons why the Jews approach Pilate. The first one is obviously this: they have no right to legally execute a criminal. But I think the second reason is they don't want the responsibility for having put Jesus to death. They're making Pilate their scapegoat. And so they are going to have to come up with some reasons why Jesus ought to be executed. And so in Luke's account, in chapter 23 and verse 2, they provide those for him. They began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be Messiah, a king." Now, if you recall from Luke chapter 22 and verses 70 and 71, here's their charge. "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." That their charge, their reason for wanting to put him to death, is that of blasphemy. The Romans could care less about blasphemy. So they have to come up with something else that will appeal to the Romans as far as being capital crimes. Every one of those that we just read are lies. They are false. In fact, especially with regards to paying taxes, he specifically said, "Whatever is Caesar's, give to Caesar." Besides all of this, this other things that are going on in the setting, there are prophecies that need to be fulfilled with regards to Jesus' death. In Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 5, "But he was pierced for our transgressions." That's speaking about crucifixion. That's not talking about stoning. And I always like to point out that when Isaiah wrote that, crucifixion wasn't even a means of execution. It hadn't been invented yet. Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, "I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced." Even Jesus said in John 12 verses 32 and 33, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die, of being lifted up on a cross. In John chapter 18, verse 32, this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. So he's going to have to die at the hands of the Romans because they're the ones that crucify. And all of this is going together to just fulfill that. Now let me just give you a little bit of background on Pilate. Pilate was hated by the Jews. And I'm pretty sure the feeling was mutual. He was appointed in 26 AD. He was cruel and oppressive. That's what Josephus tells us. He put idols up in public buildings. He was a combination of military leader, of administrator, and judge, which was what the purpose of the governor was. Later on, at the behest of the Jews, he's going to be recalled by Tiberius Caesar. He's going to be exiled by Caligula, and then he's going to commit suicide. And I just wonder if his suicide is along the lines of Judas, just a conscience that because he knows what he did here is wrong. Anyway, just something to think about. On a positive note, Pilate seems to have had a sense of justice. The problem was he didn't have the spine to back it up, because he knows Jesus is innocent and is going to say so. And finally, I need you to picture what this looks like where Jesus is before Pilate. He's been up all night and all day the day before. He has been in agony in the garden, where we read about and talked about the fact that he's sweating blood out of his sweat glands and the clothing that would have soaked that up. He's endured beating and slapping and spitting. He's been brutally treated up to this point. And it's in that condition that he's appearing before Jesus now. Now, I started with that picture. And that's the picture you normally have of Jesus before. He's serene and all of that. This is probably closer to the truth. So let's go on and look at the verse by verse here. And we'll begin reading at verse 2. And again, I'm going to ask you, because they're not going to be on the screen, to just follow along with me. Verse 2 says, as he's brought before Pilate, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. It seems like with Jesus in that condition, or that picture that I showed you at the end, that this question would be just filled with sarcasm. This person before Pilate looks nothing like a king. There's nothing royal about him. There's nothing that would seem to shout monarch. And so there's a lot of irony in that. And Jesus answers in the affirmative, "Yes, just like you said. I'm the king of the Jews." Now, the Gospel of John gives us a little bit more. Pilate went back and, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus said, and here's the key, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." If you don't get anything else from that text, you need to understand from Pilate's point of view that he knows Jesus is no threat to Rome. All of the charges that the Jews have made about how he deserves to die because he's opposed to Rome, Pilate knows the only threat to Rome are the Jews right here. So verse 3. In verse 3, the chief priests accused him of many things. So apparently they heard this interchange between Jesus and Pilate, and so they are accusing him, and they're just shouting out these accusations. The NASB, the New American Standard Bible, adds, they are accusing him harshly. They're raising their voice. In verse 4, so again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" And so Jesus is standing here silent before this absolute onslaught of accusations. The people who are shouting the accusations are the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the Jews. And he answered Pilate's previous legitimate question, "Are you a king?" And he said, "Yes, I am." But he's not going to answer this question of Pilate that has no legitimacy. And again, fulfilling prophecy. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth in Isaiah 53:7. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. So verse 5 tells us, but Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Pilate marveled. The Greek word is thaumazo, Thaumazo, and it means to wonder, to marvel. But there's another meaning that I really like, and that is Pilate admired him. That he's not caving in to them. So in light of all these charges, Jesus made no defense, and Pilate's in a tough spot. He knows Jesus is innocent. He knows the Jews are trying to railroad Jesus to a crucifixion. And it's at this point in Luke's account that Pilate finds out that, wow, you're from Galilee? And so he sends him to Herod. And there's no need for us to rehash Herod and his ilk and all of that. The fact of the matter is he's going to send him there, and now in verse 6, he's come back again. And so verse 6 tells us, now it was the custom of at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. So Matthew records as well that Pilate's wife has warned him about a dream she had. Don't have anything to do with him. Still in the background are Pilate's attempts at justice. He told them, I find no basis of a charge against him. Listen, Luke records 3 separate times that Pilate said, I find him innocent. I find no charge against him. And he even offers to flog Jesus and then release him. But now, as this verse points out, Pilate sees another possible out of this predicament that he is in, and that's the tradition of the governor releasing a prisoner of the choice of the crowd. And the tradition is one of showing amnesty to someone, to show the kindness and generosity of the government. And Pilate knows Jesus' popularity. He's the miracle worker. He's the one who they claimed as king. And so he knows about that. So now we go on to, wrong one, verse 7 and 8. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. And so here we have Barabbas introduced. He's a robber in other translation or other editions of this event. He's a murderer. He's a leader of an insurrection. And the crowd is now coming up to say, Pilate, okay, we want you to offer amnesty to one of the prisoners of our choice. Apparently, Barabbas, as we kind of jump ahead, was the worst of the three, because his cross is the one in the middle. And it's going to be on his cross that Jesus is going to be crucified. Jesus is actually going to take his place. I also find a great deal of irony in the fact that the name Barabbas means son of the Father. When in reality it would be God's real son who's going to be on that cross. So verses 9 and 10. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. Do you want me to release your king? You can almost hear the scorn in those words. And the irony again that you have a pagan ruler here who is giving the Jews a chance to make a choice to undo the greater evil that their leaders are about to do by killing an innocent man. And perhaps hoping that when he says, do you want me to release the king of the Jews, that they will say, Jesus. Listen, 5 days ago they were shouting he was king. Of course, the leaders, as we've seen all along, are jealous of Jesus' fame, his popularity, his teaching. They are horrible about what he's done to their business in the temple. They know he would displace them in the hearts of the people. And they really do, I believe, feel that if this is allowed to go along, that Rome will come and take away their place. Listen, that's going to happen anyway. So they threaten Pilate again. We have no king but Caesar. There's a threat in that. If you let this guy go, Caesar's going to find out about it from us, that you let a person who was claiming to be king go, when we were saying, you're our king, Caesar, you need to get rid of this guy, this governor. Listen, the further Pilate goes, refusing to do what is right and refusing to do what is just, because again, he knows the Jews just are trying to kill Jesus, and he knows Jesus is innocent, but the further he goes, the worse it becomes for him. The Gospel of John records the efforts of Pilate, that Pilate made to save him. You got the wife warning him. You got his conscience warning him. You have him beating Jesus and putting a purple robe on and say, does this look like a threat to Rome? After he's just standing there having been scourged. The problem with Pilate is that his politics won't allow him to do the right thing, which would be just to let him go. So verse 11. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. The chief priest stirred up the crowd. They persuaded them to shout for Barabbas. And I'm not sure what their story was. I don't know what they're telling the Jewish people. I will tell you that my personal opinion is it's not the local people. It's not the people that have been around for 2 years and know about Jesus' miracles and seen what... This crowd is made up mostly of people from out of the country who've made their once-in-a-lifetime trip to Jerusalem for the Passover and will stay for Pentecost. They've got stars in their eyes. They've got the chief priest, man, they're wanting me to say Barabbas. I'll say Barabbas, and so they do that. In verse 12, Pilate says, well, what shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Pilate asked them. What am I going to do with Jesus? The one, again, you just called a few days ago your king. And in the process of the Jews convincing the crowd to ask for Barabbas, they also are telling the crowd Jesus needs to be crucified. They're probably telling him he's a false Messiah, he's a false Christ, he's bad for the country. But that's what they do. And so in verse 13, crucify him, they shouted. They're led into this hysteria by their leaders, and they've lost all sense. And listen, it's hard for me to understand that just a few days ago they're shouting king, and now they're shouting kill him. And so the crowd joins the ranks of the murderers of Jesus. Listen, even though it's God's will that this happen, they do not lose their culpability, their guilt and responsibility for it. In fact, you'll notice that Peter, in the sermon in Acts, the 2nd chapter, I'm probably shining, I'm shining a green light back there, said, fellow Israelites, this is Peter speaking to the crowds, many of them, most of them perhaps there. Listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, speaking of the Romans, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So their guilt remains. So let's go on now to verse 14. Why, Pilate said, what crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. You can see, Pilate is still incredulous. What evil has he done? The mob is beyond justice. They're beyond sense. They just shout louder and louder. They're out of control. And at the time that Jesus is going to be on the cross is the same time which most of these people are going to be preparing their lamb for the Passover feast, which is a celebration of God's freeing them from bondage in Egypt. Again, all of this is God's plan. And finally, verse 15, Pilate gives in. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and then handed him over to be crucified. Now, in Matthew's account, it says when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I'm innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. And it was their responsibility, but it's also Pilate's responsibility. He can't just wash his hands of that. It was his job, it was his responsibility as a leader of government, a God-given government, to not wield the sword in vain. And he's doing it for no reason here. Why he had Jesus beaten and handed over to be crucified, I have no idea. My opinion is that was done right there in front of everybody, so they could see. So let's bring the lesson to a conclusion. In the end of this story, there is nothing honorable to be found in Pilate. We already talked about the fact he had him beaten, he had him dressed in purple. Maybe he was trying to elicit some sympathy from the crowd, but in the end, he's going to cave to their wishes. Easier to kill Jesus than have an insurrection on your hands in his mind. I think it's interesting that earlier in John's account, or the Gospel of John's account, is when he asked Jesus, what is truth? And there's a great song, and I love the sense of it. He wanted to know what truth was, and it was standing right in front of him in the form of Jesus Christ. And he did nothing with it. In fact, he ignored it. And then he acted falsely. And I would just remind you that all of this is occurring in and as a result of the will of God. And that is that his son would die on the cross. According to Paul in Romans, this was the only way that God could be just and justify us, is to have his sinless son die. And it was his will that is going to be accomplished. And you know, as we go through this long process of Jesus' trials and death and suffering here, I think that we need to see in that the opportunity that we have, as we just memorialized in the Lord's Supper, the benefit that we get from all of that we cannot forget that. And I'll just leave this thought with you here as we stop, that like Pilate, you get to make a judgment about Jesus. You get to decide if he was innocent. You get to decide if he was really the Son of God. You get to decide if he really died on the cross for you and that his blood can cleanse you. That's a judgment that you get to make. I hope that you do a better job of judging than Pilate did. And take advantage of this. Make the result of what happened to Jesus the result that God and Christ himself wanted, and that is that people would be saved, and more specifically, that you would be saved. If there's some way that we can help you with your relationship with the Lord this morning, then we invite you to come forward while we're singing this song and let us do that. If you're not ready to do that now and you want to do it another time or afterwards, there's no time limit on this except for when the Lord comes. And I don't know when that's going to happen, but please don't feel like you have to come this very moment. But if you want to, we will rejoice with you and help you in whatever way we can while we stand and sing.